Hi, this is Puad189, and today I'm going to talk about how to study for history, or what are the best ways to make sure that you get the most accurate information out of whatever your fancy is. Um, it's quite easy and quite simple, but I'm going to give you a few examples just so you know. Let's see. Currently, at the moment, I am reading The Greatest Night by Thomas Asbridge, and it is about William Marshall. And if none of you know that, then William Marshall is the probably one of the greatest knights, if not the greatest knight ever to live. Essentially, I've heard about him for a few places online, read about him. Apparently, he still fought at the age of 70 on the front lines, and I am currently reading this story to essentially just get an idea of what his career was like. But is this a good source of information? Would I be able to make a video of William Marshall after I read this book? Probably not. I would need to do some extra research for that. You see, this book is it's quite good. The historian that wrote it is fairly renowned. It says he's the author of the Crusades, the authoritative history of the War of the Holy Land, and the First Crusade, and that shows that he knows a lot about this kind of era in history. Apparently, William Marshall was with Eleanor of Aquitaine, not with, as in not like with her, but like he was alive when she was alive, and that is around the Second Crusade, and they were not. That was not too far from the First Crusade, so he knows this era of history. But there aren't a lot of anecdotes so far from what I've read in this. There's not a lot of notes in it either. Um, there is a good glossary, but it doesn't really show a lot of primary sources that he's used in order to, research this. I'm sure he has, obviously, because he's a renowned historian, but that does not make me wholly trust the book to be 100% accurate. What I do think, I want to give it the benefit of the doubt because um, even though it's written in a story-like manner, it's still it still has a lot of information to give. But at the same time, what I would need to do in order to make a video about this, about William Marshall, would be to then take what I've learned in this book and then find information from primary sources to connect the dots. Just recently, I listened to Extra Credits History on Hannibal, and apparently they did not get the number count of deaths in the Battle of Cannae, which is probably the most famous battle Hannibal ever did. And I love Roman history, but I haven't brushed up on a bunch of stuff in the third century BC for Rome. I usually focused on stuff like in the first century or uh, BC and first century AD. And currently, I'm reading this kind of bright. Sorry, the Caesar's Conquest of Gaul, and this is a primary source. This source is essentially Caesar as the author himself, and is talking about his conquests from 58 BC down to, I'd like to say 52 BC. I'm not entirely certain with that. Oh, to 50 BC. And I know that he went into Gaul and conquered all of Gaul, and then he made two excursions into Germania and then two excursions into Britain, which had never been attacked or settled before by the Romans, and he started that. A lot of people don't know that Julius Caesar, his first claim to fame wasn't being a tyrant; it was being one of the greatest generals in history, from then and even now. Um, he was a lot like a lot of generals after Alexander the Great. He was kind of an Alexander the Great imitator, a little bit, or every Roman general was. I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. The point is that I recently took a video at face value, and I've scolded myself to not do that before, and I did it again. But and that was just, I honestly though watched the extra credits video to get a base knowledge of what happened with Hannibal, just like how I'm getting a base knowledge of what's happening with, or what happened with William Marshall. But this is not something that I can then lecture on or make a video of. I will need to read this and then, sorry, something my, I need to read this and then I would need to then find primary sources, as I said, to connect the dots. This is a primary source of Julius Caesar and his conquest of Gaul and Britain and Germania. This is something that you can trust. Now, this is what I would call a tertiary source. It is a source that I would read, as I said, sorry, I'm repeating myself, to get a basis of things. So if I read this, I will then know about his life. But to fine tune myself, if I am actually a historian, I would need to then search for any primary sources, or at least anything that I could find that's more accurate than a historian's rendition of what happened. Now, there are secondary sources. One of the greatest known secondary sources of a lot of ancient, Greek and Roman. Wow, this light, I'm so sorry, it even makes me look pale. Of Greek and Roman stuff is Plutarch. And this is volume 1 of Plutarch's Lives. Plutarch is a secondary source. And he never called himself a historian, he called himself a biographer. Because what Plutarch did was he got many famous Romans and famous Greeks, or famous people from Anatolia, and then he would write biographies about them and then compare them to one another. For instance, Themistocles with Camillus, or he compared Lycurgus, the lawgiver of Sparta, who began the Spartan constitution, with Numa Pompilius. And I don't know who Numa is. I need to finish this book. But this is a secondary source. And why is it a secondary source? Well, one, as I said, he didn't call himself a historian, but what really matters is that he is writing about men who lived 100, 200, 300, up to 500 years before he was alive. Plutarch lived in the 2nd century AD, and he grew up around Athens. He wasn't born in Athens, but he lived close to Athens, and he was a Roman citizen too. He actually learned Latin, so he knew Greek and Latin, and he got a bunch of sources that we don't know about. But he found sources all over Greece and Rome, and he began to write all about the various famous peoples. And so essentially, but he wasn't around when they were alive, at least for the most part. Actually, I don't think he ever wrote a biography about someone who was alive when he was. So he has met no one. However, he still lived far closer to Lycurgus than we did, and he also has sources that we can't find anymore. And Plutarch, honestly, if you know anything about him, he's a very trustworthy individual, but at the same time, we can't take just that trust on face value. So, he would be a secondary source. Now, I will compare them. This is a primary source. This is from Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar wrote this. In fact, this is a collection of all of his memoirs that he sent back to Rome as he was conquering Gaul. So this is him. He's telling everything that did happen, and he would have people around him, his centurions, anyone really who would be able to say that didn't happen if he lied. So it's essentially just business reports that he's sending back, although he does give it in a very clear, precise prose that is easy to read. It's almost like a story. And I think that something that a lot of people back in the day, in antiquity, one of the best things that they were able to do was write in a way that made everything sound heroic, even if it wasn't. That would be a primary source. This would be a secondary source. He did write about a bunch of people's biographies, Demetrius, Pyrrhus, I believe he also wrote Leonidas. It wouldn't be in my copy. And King Agesilaus II, one of my favorite Spartan kings. but he wasn't alive then, and or when they were alive, so we would need to trust this as a secondary source. He is good with bringing anecdotes, and he is good with giving information that connects the dots to other things. And then this would be a tertiary source. This is the source that you would read to get a basis of knowledge of what you need to know about this legendary figure, William Marshall. And I am very glad I bought this book. And it's very interesting so far, and everything I've read in it sounds like it is going with pure facts, even if it is in a very story-like prose. You can tell he did his research. However, at the same time, which makes me trust him, but at the same time, it doesn't make me trust him enough to where I can use this as a basis for a video if I'm going to teach history, or for me, if I was a professor teaching a class. I could not go by this book alone and then start giving people lessons and then expect them to go write books, because then it'd be like Chinese whispers to when, you know, one historian says one thing and another historian says another thing, and then their students say one thing and then their students say another thing, and then eventually it talks that William Marshall conquered the Third Crusade, and you don't know how you got there. So you always need to go to primary sources first and then secondary sources. But if you want to begin, this kind of book would work. So I just wanted to give a quick note on that. I'm going to be making some more videos soon. And also, even though I mentioned extra credits history, I'm not saying anything wrong about them, but I would treat them as a tertiary source, just like how I would treat probably anyone that makes a video, even Metatron or Scala Gladiatoria, maybe secondary sources at best. And that's not to say that, you know, they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, every historian can make mistakes. I mean, I, on a whim, trusted extra credits history, but the point is that unless your historian gives a lot of anecdotes, or unless your historian gives a lot of reasoning behind what he says, or unless you already trust the historian because he's given you a lot of correct information, and unless he cites certain things or he shows that he's read books like this, you shouldn't really trust him out of the blue. I remember I was talking to one of my friends one time about Sparta, and there was Historiolus Civilius. I forgot that YouTube channel's name. And then there was another YouTube channel, I forgot their name. But then there was Invicta, and Invicta I trust, and he had the closest video that showed the actual Spartan constitution that I've seen. And Sparta in Greek history is my specialty, and so is my specialty is pretty much Greek history, Macedonian history. I'm fairly good at medieval history, Roman history in the first centuries AD and BC. Hannibal is in the 3rd century BC. And though I know stuff about Hannibal, I didn't really look up a bunch of stuff about his battles, even though I know they're famous. I've learned my favorite part of history is military, and I've learned a ton of stuff on a bunch of generals, but there's so many of them. Although honestly, from what I've learned since then, Hannibal's one of the greatest. You can't get much better than Hannibal. In fact, I'm going to make a series of the top 10 generals or commanders that I've ever heard of. Soon it'll be probably 11 video series, one with an introduction and then 10 more to show the top 10. But as a disclaimer, I don't know every general or commander in history. The ones that I will make videos about, I will research them completely. I already know about 6 of them like the back of my hand. And the next 4 I need to actually plan on who they will be. And if there's someone that I don't know very well yet, then I'm going to need to read some more primary sources on them. But the point is that history is a lot like investigation. You have written records, you have archaeological sources, and then you have secondary sources, and then the modern tertiary source. There is no book written today that is a secondary source unless it is about something that has happened in our lifetimes. Um, at best, actually, I might take that back. At best, it's a secondary source because I usually just read primary sources. And if I'm in the middle of learning something, then I'll read or watch something that's tertiary, and then I'll get into a primary source. And then if the historian does that and they finish their primary source, then I suppose you could then call them a secondary source if everything that they've learned and they've fine-tuned it from a primary source. You could perhaps do that, but that's stretching it. That's definitely stretching it because I don't know. I'm sorry. I tend to ramble when it comes to history, but I'm gonna. So there's that. I'm just gonna end it there because like, I'm gonna keep rambling. But I'm gonna make more videos soon, and I appreciate you watching this video, and I hope you don't mind this ugly mug, and y'all have a good day. Thank you.